Seema Padman is Senior Vice President, Human Resources India and APAC at Epsilon and has been with Epsilon since March 2015. In a career spanning over 20 years, she has worked in multiple areas of HR, probably covering the entire spectrum. So we decided to pick Seema's brains about leadership development in the remote first world. We spoke about different aspects of work life that changed after March 2020, challenges they faced at Epsilon, and how they overcame them. Seema has always had great insights about L&D and leadership development. We spoke about what are the hallmarks of a great leadership development program. She also talked about some interesting experiments they've tried at Epsilon. So, if you've been thinking about reimagining learning and development and leadership development in the post pandemic world, you'll find this conversation very useful. Welcome, Seema. Welcome to the CTQ Smartcast.
Thank you, Harish. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I think we first met in the early days of the lockdown, and I think middle of 2020, right?
That's
So
right.
this is a good time to ask that million-dollar question, right? So what has changed since March 2020 in terms of culture and engagement?
A lot has changed, or I hope it has changed for the good as well. So in the early stages, I think when we had the conversation, we were trying to figure out how we kind of navigate that, because we'd gone out of that first initial few months of trying to survive and get all of our HR practices and processes aligned with people being remote, getting people on board. How do you kind of onboard them? We've just about figured that. And I think when we started to kind of the stage two, as I would say, is when we reached out to you, Harish, and to figure out, is there a better way of doing things, right? And I think we've learned through the process, there are some things that work, there are some things that don't work. And we tried to kind of incorporate that in terms of how we engage with our people, how we continue to kind of build our culture, especially when we have so many new people. And I think one endorsement that's happened in that process is we also participate in the Great Place to Work early this year, and the surveys kind of come back with great results. And it feels like we've got certified as a great place to work. This overarching statement around all things considered, I think Epsilon's a great place to work. Definitely scored a 90, which is I think phenomenal for us. And I was very heartened to see some of the comments that came through in the feedback as well. It feels like a family-like environment is what a lot of comments said. So that feels like a great thing to have achieved during the time of being remote, to convey a sense of family. And I think all of the things that we do through our leaders, through our managers, in terms of staying connected, really communicating with our people has seen success. What's changed, therefore, is a validation of some of the things that we do, and also learnings along the way as to what we need to do differently. That's what stands out to me.
Right. Yeah. I think, congratulations on the Great Place to Work certification. Sure, it must have been the, proof of the pudding, right? Proof is always in the pudding. So it's all the hard work that you put in, not just in these 2 years, but over the years, which has sort of culminated in this, right? Because these things are not, things that can be changed overnight. It's a lot of hard work that goes into it. So, given this context of the last 2 years, so what were the initial challenges, and if you can give us some concrete examples of how you sort of overcame those initial challenges, the phase 1 to phase 2 that you talked about.
Yeah, I think the initial piece is just to try and replicate what you did in the physical world to the virtual world, right? And that isn't an ideal way. You're just trying to replicate everything, and over time you learn through the process of what works, what doesn't work, and then change and shift to fit in with the this complete remote working. So if I take an example of engagement activities and engagement initiatives, most companies tend to do larger ones and bring everybody together, large town halls, large initiatives. And we realized that the commitment towards larger organizational initiatives is actually less. People actually turn up for the what we call the micro events. So a focus on the micro culture, I think, is really important. So it's all down to the leaders and them kind of taking that. And I think that's what our leaders did. So that's a shift that's happened. And so we've kind of tried to put things that could be led or could be driven by leaders and driven by teams. And so more teams have come up with their own way of engaging and allowing that to happen within their teams rather than force fitting and getting everybody together. And I think that's part two, where we realize that we can't just because when you started off in this remote work mode with the pandemic, you always thought it was temporary. You thought it was a few months down the line. We kind of say, oh, we closed for a few weeks, and you're back. But then at some point it hits you that is not, and you got to embrace it and find newer ways of working. So things around learning and development, things around leadership development, and how we approach it have also looked different in that time.
Right. I think that's a great insight there, Seema, about thinking of microcultures. It's like the famous two pizza rule of Amazon, right? I think that's the number of people that you can probably try to realistically influence in terms of engagement and culture. So having this broad brushstrokes of let's have this company wide engagement and all, it's fraught with danger in terms of what you expect and what you get out of it. People have other things to do. Let's just admit it. Be honest about it, right?
We've still done those. I'm not saying that we haven't. We tried those, and over time we realized, okay, this is not working, because you track. The commitment to your immediate team is much higher than the commitment to the organization.
Yeah. So I think that's a great insight that that is. I think it's an underlying principle that should be thought of in multiple facets of organization culture, design, leadership development. Because what you're essentially saying is don't try to take the one size fits all approach, right? Look at different teams, look at different levels where people are, maybe duration in the company, their tenure, that makes a difference. So given all these kind of insights that you're talking about, which is getting, where I think we're getting more and more into personalization zone, right? Where it's n is equal to 1. So how is L&D sort of gearing up for this now with this personalization, overarching theme? How is that sort of panning out for you guys at Epsilon, and what have you done in that space?
So on the learning and development, I think there's more to do. I wouldn't say that we've kind of really made inroads, but you've touched on the right word, Harish, personalization. I think increasingly that's what I'm coming to in terms of conclusion around a lot of the people practices. Right, and it's there's a view that, or at least organizations and leadership, learning and development teams held that in terms of learning, only a certain type of people learn, or learning ability was kind of restricted to a few. But in reality, that everybody learns, right? It depends on why you need to learn, right? If you need to fix something you on your laptop, or you're able to go and look it up on YouTube and fix something. And so it's essentially being able to identify what the person needs to learn, make it relevant for them, and then provide that. That's a bit more of a longer journey, because all of our programs are not kind of there yet. We still have standard programs, and we expect people to turn up, and we expect people to participate. But what we've done is increase the amount of self-learning options that people have in terms of things that they could take, like licenses they could have, whether it's LinkedIn Learning or Udemy. That I think has seen a higher take up, because then people say, I'm in control of this. It is something that is relevant for me. It is at my pace and at my time, and I can do this well. So that's definitely helped in the space of personalization. But we still haven't, on other aspects, we haven't gotten there. For core job skills, that I think is working well. And development, which is related to doing their day-to-day work, I feel has improved compared to in-person working.
Right, right. And do you see people sort of taking charge of their learning journey? Maybe your job is just to establish the why, and after that, individuals taking charge of their, learning needs. Earlier, it used to be the thing was the organization is going to take care of my learning. It is their job to sort of upskill me. Have you seen that shift in individuals?
Not everybody. Again, time can be a constraint.
Hmm.
And I think because learning has always suffered from that, it's never urgent. It's an important thing, it's never urgent. But I think leaders kind of emphasizing learning is an important, what leaders showcase in terms of learning and how much they talk about learning and how much they invest in personal development plans really helps. um, Still there are, it gets deprioritized, but because it is at your own pace, I feel that, and I shouldn't say I feel, we've had a discussion when it came to hybrid working, and we did a little survey exercise with some of the leaders in the organization, and most people said core learning for the job actually has improved. It could also be because, and this take up could also be that your access to learning through osmosis has gone away, right? Otherwise, there's a great opportunity in the organization to observe somebody in a meeting, to observe something happening in the organization, and then kind of choose, that actually influencing you to some bit and influencing your learning. Because that has gone away, people have to kind of put in the effort. But I think, teams where the leaders don't reflect that and take ownership, where leaders don't show that they are learning themselves, it doesn't work. So you got to have that also in place.
Right. So, can you give me some concrete examples of how leaders have modeled this behavior that you're talking about, where they have talked about what they are learning? If you can give me some concrete examples, that would be great.
Sure. One program that we'd started, and this was pre-pandemic, we'd actually put it in place, and it was called Inspiration Infinity for our leadership folks at the leadership level. One of the elements of that learning was a teach back. So, and we try to incorporate that teach back. So whatever you learn, some elements of it, you go and do sessions for either your managers, whichever level you want to take. So I've seen a few leaders do that very well, and kind of, that's a great signal. And to kind of say, I have done this program as part of that, this is something I will do. We've incorporated that into our manager development program as well, where we the team co-facilitates with leaders, and their own, reflections and learnings come into play. So that's them making time for other people's development. I think is a great signal, and that's one thing that we've done very well. That's a more systemic piece that we've kind of incorporated into some of our programs. Other pieces, coaching, mentoring, it's ad hoc. I wouldn't say it's kind of done systemically where we put in processes, but this one I feel really good about in terms of how it's been approached.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And over the last 2 years, it's been only e-learning, right? Earlier, e-learning was one of the options. I guess now in-person sessions are, very rare. We have done one in-person workshop after a long time last week, but it's been a complete shift in terms of e-learning, right? So, how has that been accepted? What have been the reservations that people have shown, and how have you sort of help people overcome those reservations, that yeah, e-learning is okay, it's not just for individuals for themselves, but even for leaders, to get them to convince their teams to take up
Yeah.
e-learning? How has that journey been?
Yeah, so it's been hard before. I mean, in India particularly, we found that take up of e-learning and virtual learning opportunities before the pandemic was limited.
Right.
Then it was no choice, right? You really had to have, you didn't have an option, but if you wanted to learn, that was the only way. We did set an expectation that people would invest at least 48 hours in their learning, in their own development, and that is part of the goal setting process. In your goals, when you set, you have to kind of say that you will do 48 hours of learning and identify what that will be. That will have to be self-reported out, and some of it is tracked as well. And it could be any form. Reading a book could be classified as that. Whatever form of learning that you've done is acceptable. And people had to self-report out, and that's an element of your goals plus performance assessment. So that has been. Then on a necessary basis, once it becomes necessary, people have taken up, and we've seen a good sign up for a lot of the programs that we have, regularly communicating that with our people, and making sure, and we've done smaller spurts of sessions, right? Rather than long learning sessions, smaller in time learning, and more customized learning for teams has also helped in kind of enabling that, I would say.
Right. I think that's that's great that you've talked about different kinds of learning, because these days, if I just take my personal example, I do courses, I read a lot, I listen to podcasts, I interview guests like you. That's also a great way for me to learn. So I put all of this under my learning time, right? So it's not fair if somebody says, no, what is the number of hours that you put in on a learning course, and that's the only way I'm learning. I wouldn't accept that. So that's great that you've allowed people to self-report using wherever they are learning.
Yeah. And I think one interesting piece, I was reading this somewhere the other time, right? It's that why leadership development. I'm sorry, I'm diverging. You asked about learning and development, just to kind of a little bit into leadership development, right? Why leadership development has always been difficult. I always feel that, it's not an easy one to crack. And it's increasingly more difficult now because typically leadership development addresses three kinds of transitions, right? It's a vertical transition, it's a lateral transition, or it's a geographical transition, a functional transition, those kind of things, right? Very, very clear transitions. But during the pandemic, if you look at all of the managers and leaders, they've had to make a lot of internal transitions and invisible transitions, as I would call, and not a lot of development supports it. And that's why you've got to allow various forms of development. And also one important thing that article references, that we do a lot of sense making at this time. In a situation like the pandemic, there is a lot of inward looking that happens as well, and that also contributes to a lot of learning, right? And you shouldn't miss that out in terms of it's an important constituent of learning, and we try to weave that at least in some of our leadership development programs, that sense making element.
Yeah. Can you expand a bit on that? I mean, how has that been the whole thing about sense making? What was the response?
Sure. So this is where I think we kind of got in touch with you around, the hybrid piece and how that evolved, right? So we were thinking about, with the pandemic and how work evolved, what happened was that people who needed to work together and in their own business unit, they were connecting more easily. So if you look at social capital in the organization, there's building social capital, which is deeply connecting with people you work with on a day-to-day basis. And somehow that happened because you were on more frequent calls, you were connecting and you were talking, and all of that happened. But another important concept is bridging social capital, which is across the organization, right? That connections. And especially at leadership level, that's important because in leadership roles, it's somewhat lonely, right? You have a facade, or I say facade. I believe in authentic leadership, but people hold back, right? They can't be as share some of their challenges very openly. They fewer people to talk to about, right? So that bridging social capital becomes very important at the leadership level, and that's when we wondered, how do we kind of enable that? Where you bump into somebody in the cafeteria, have a chat with them and talk to them, all of that. So this is where we brought 35 of our leaders, at director and above, to think about how work is evolving, how workplace is going to look like in the future, how employees are going to behave, and all of that. And we looked at 3-4 critical aspects that will be impacted with this remote work. One was around, design, org design, office design, all of those elements. The second piece was around culture. The third was around innovation, which everybody said was impacted. The fourth was around new hires and them coming in and really, really being inculcated into the organization and feeling that sense of connect. And the last one was, to some extent, what we called was democratization of access, right? Your access to leaders is democratized. And so there were 5 teams that were created, and these were they cut across, and they had to work over a period of 6, we didn't envisage it to be 6 months, but it kind of extended to a pretty much a 6-month initiative, where they worked in groups, came back with a recommendation to the leaders. And I think a lot of times you think about the outcomes of such of these programs and what did it result in. But essentially, we were trying to do the bridging social capital, get people who typically don't have to interact with each other to come and work together, have a point of view, develop a point of view which is outside of their day-to-day work. So think a little forward. We also, put in each of these team a Gen Y member, a different generation, so that you could bring in that perspective as well, and got them to come back and present, right? And in that process, this team had to, at the end, we had to do an activity around sense making. How did you arrive at decisions? How did you, deal with conflict? Did you tend to agree? Did you tend to this thing? What leadership style did you show? Is this your normal leadership style, right? So there is an element of, getting them to think. We worked with an external consultant who really shaped the program as well. And so that, I think, was a great experiment for us to see how it kind of panned out and how that brought people together.
Right. Yeah. And one specific thing that I wanted to pick on there was the innovation. That's generally one area that organizations and people across levels say that, yeah, that's the one which has suffered a lot in these last 2 years, because it's difficult for people to come together and think about these, complete white spaces, right? It's easier to do business as usual. Transactional stuff is easy because very clearly defined, but these are spaces, which have not been an area of strength for a lot of organizations, because they have been used to doing it in a different way till 2020. So how has that been, post that exercise? How have things changed? How have things improved, got better?
We really haven't kind of, I think one of the things around all of these activities is that it is hard to break from how you've typically done it. It's hard to think really completely imaginatively and let go of the past. And I think that has been a constraint in some of the recommendations also that we see, right? So it's been typically the responses around, Google does this 20% innovation time. And we had to kind of say, think differently about this. I don't see that as a space. I don't see as this kind of shifted. We're trying to do some events now at this time, but it's still revolving around bringing more people to the office and connecting with each other to kind of deliver it. I don't think a lot has changed. It was interesting that is one is hard to crack, because it's for people to kind of think differently, and innovation doesn't happen because you sit with the same type of people who think like you, right? It has to be with different types of people, different levels of people, and I think we've not been able to really make use of that. It was interesting that I was in the office today, and one conversation at lunch was that, and somebody was mentioning, quoting an article that they had read, that actually the number of patent filing has come down, and compared to previous years, and it is something that organizations need to invest more time. And one of the leaders who I work with really put it, saying, we are surviving, we're not thriving, and some of the effects of how we are working now probably will be felt in the next couple of years only, not immediately, because we are not really ideating and looking at new ways of doing things and new ways of working together.
Right. Yeah. So that organized serendipity, as we call it, where we sort of get these things to, people to collaborate across teams. We've seen that, that's something which has gone down, and we've been working a lot on that. But one thing that struck me again, Seema, is, what you mentioned right now about, infusing that diversity of thought. We know you've made a conscious effort to increase the number of women in the workforce. Even when you talked about those, groups, you said you deliberately inserted a Gen Y member in each team. So that clearly seems to be a pet area for you, where you acknowledge the importance of it and are, making conscious efforts to introduce that diversity of thought. So talk me through your views on it, and how have people accepted, not accepted this line of thought.
It is not easy to kind of do that really well, because what happens is, in a group of leaders who are at director level, you introduce a Gen Y, unless the person is super confident and in a set of leaders and can kind of, that level of acceptance, it's hard for them, right? They very easily led down a certain path. So you might, one person alone actually might be lonely, is my insight. I think you got to have 3-4 people backing the individual, or kind of charging it as well. But it's a way to kind of seed some thought and seed some thinking. And I think there's definitely people who will benefit from that, seeding that perspective. One thing that we started, and I think a lot of organizations do it as well, is reverse mentoring, right? You hear that. We did that last year with our new grad population. So we asked a set of leaders as to who would want to be participate in the reverse mentoring program. We asked the new grads. I actually thought that there'd be more new grads signing up for it, but we actually had an equal number, and we were able to pair people. And that also is a way to kind of get different perspectives into the organization. So this is one of the things that we think about. How can you kind of do that? I don't think we've completely got it very well, but in some of our leadership programs, we try and make sure that the gender mix is equal. This Gen Y introduction, the reverse mentoring piece. And another piece that we want to kind of think about is around Gen Zs and how the newest members of the workforce, what will they need and what will they bring? Because their concept of work is very different. They start itself from a very different place, right? And you don't know what that is. But we haven't been able to kind of figure that one out. But through initiatives like this, I think more and more infusing and deliberately putting somebody there or a group there actually makes a difference. And I've always maintained that the leaders who make decisions in organizations are always a generation or 2 generations apart from the people who have to bear the brunt of those decisions.
Right.
And it's very unfortunate, right? And so I would say consciously kind of really engaging with people. And I was listening to you mentioned a podcast, Harish, that's one way to learn. And I think there's a lot of excellent content out there for people to consume. And one person who's done immense work around the D&I space was saying that there are simple things that you can do. Just look at your calendar and look at the people that you meet with on a day-to-day basis. If all of them are the similar type of people, then there is an issue, right? If they are either of the same level, either of the same gender, or similar backgrounds, clearly there's an issue with what perspective building you can get as a leader, right? The second piece is that what do you watch? What does your feed tell you? If your feed is telling you, reinforcing your thinking again and again, then there's never diversity happening, right? What are you watching? What are you reading? All of those are aspects that are things to watch out. So deliberately picking different people to interact with, different people to meet with, actually helps leaders to kind of see things from a different lens.
We have this notion of information diet. We equate it to the traditional Indian thali. You need the dal, you need the rasam, you need the pickle, you need the dessert. But you can't have all dessert, right? Which is what we end up tending to have in our information diet. Our feeds are full of things that we absolutely love. Sometimes you need, something of each. You need some salt as well on the side.
Yeah.
You need to
Yeah.
be
And when you
careful about it.
mention salt, right, it's the equivalent of, what do you say? The other example that this person who done the research said was that think of the people who are closest to you, right? And they have figured out a way to work with you. Even they might be giving you feedback, but they might be validating what you're thinking as well. And so how do you get feedback from people who don't think like you? And how can you open yourself up to that as a leader? All things I'm thinking is, as an individual myself, what can I do differently around that, and consciously do those little things? Because you cannot do big changes. You've got to make these little shifts, and all of them adding up to something larger, I feel.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned reverse mentoring. So what were were there any interesting examples of themes or topics on which these people were mentored by the
Yeah,
younger?
from some conversations, we've had conversation. I think one of the things was that trying to understand what creates employee loyalty, and what are the factors. And I think that was one aspect. It is about that immediate manager. I don't think it's anything new, but that immediate manager, particularly in remote working, that's the only person they have access to, more access to. plays a very significant role in kind of shaping the individual's perspective and individual's thinking, right? So the immediate manager is a huge aspect. What else I'm trying to see was from last year. And I had two mentees or two mentors. Sorry, I was the mentee. They did bring up perspectives from other organizations as to what they were doing, and I think how we onboard our new grads, right? And I think there was some learning around that, because they were again, this is an example of classically how you replicate what happens in the physical world to the virtual world, because it's a 8 to 12 weeks program, and poor kids, come to the organization expecting something different, and it's exactly the same as in college, that they're subjected to the same. So you had to really, this year we're thinking about what do we need to do differently around engagement, around breaking that up a little bit more, because rather than making it monotonous. So that those are the kind of feedback, right? Can you do some self-study rather than everything in the class or in the session with a facilitator, and do some self-learning, and probably get them to interact more as a team and learn from each other, is what the organization facilitates. So even condense the amount of time you express. That was one definite feedback that we got.
Right. Yeah, I think, for me personally as well, the sessions that we do where we help companies onboard these fresh graduates are very satisfying, because you can actually help them, and you probably even, shaping some careers, right? Shaping the beginnings of some great careers. So that's personally very satisfying and interesting for me. Not talking to people of our age, our generation, but you're actually getting some, new insights from these kids, as you say.
Yeah.
Right. But generally, what has your sense been in terms of the expectations of these people who are, uh, joining the workforce in the last 1-2 years, 22, 23-year-olds?
Yeah. I think they find it hard to imagine how workplaces are like, and how their energy is, because what they've heard from the experience of their parents around workplaces are very different to how workplaces are today, right? And the Epsilon office in particular has been a very vibrant. There's a lot of people who come to interview with us say there's a vibrancy about this place. It might be how the office is done up and how it looks, but there's a certain element of vibrancy, and we are trying to now at this time try and engage more with bringing in our newer folks, new grads, and coming to the office and saying how can we kind of show them what it was like, because they don't get to see, and I feel the newer people in the workforce are the most impacted by a lack of learning opportunities that are provided to them, because you sit in a project meeting and you get to learn from so many situations and scenarios and discuss it, really get perspectives from different people. All of that is lost. It's a very transactional way to kind of talk to your screen, and then that's about it, right? So it's hard. It's hard for the folks. So that's what we're trying to make sure we kind of do.
Right. And has there been anything different that you did with the onboarding of new employees, especially now that you have the option of working in the hybrid mode? Have you done anything different? Because we've seen organizations taking this approach that new employees, that indoctrination period is very important. So we want them to sort of join in office because now we have that option. So they're flying them to their base locations, letting them work in office, and then asking them to work from home, or depending on how their teams have decided. Have you also taken an approach like that?
We are starting. I think we have started the conversation around doing our first in-person onboarding, probably end of this month. We're trying to put the elements together because our office is still optional and flexible. And I think just bringing them into the office without other people being present also doesn't work. Right? You have to kind of. So the first step for us is to kind of see how we get our folks who are in Bangalore to kind of start coming to the office 1 or 2 days, and how can that be organic? And everybody who comes to the office immediately says, wow, this is great. I enjoyed it. It's like meeting a bunch of friends, right? You meet your college friends, and the time you meet them, you say, fabulous, we'll meet every once a month, and it fizzles out, right?
Right.
So somebody has to keep that energy going.
Right.
And so we're trying to see, how can there be an anchor in each team,
Hmm.
and that person holding it together. Otherwise, it's, and it'll take a few attempts to then start becoming organic, and
Hmm.
then start bring the newer folks in as well. But we haven't so far. We haven't done the hybrid. I'm sure it's going to be full of learning and full of
Hmm.
challenges
Right.
that we will
Yeah.
encounter.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, we've seen the teams which have taken a very an honest view of this, that we will really have to offer something of value to people to come to office, and just asking them to come for the sake of it is not going to keep them coming for too long.
yeah,
If they know that very clearly, then I think companies have done wonders, because then you're treating it with that kind of respect, right?
yeah,
And if it is scarce, when people are coming in, you're actually making sure you want to get the best out of it.
yeah.
If you're getting them to come every day, then they'll get jaded, and then soon you'll have the same old complaints of commute, and why do I really need to be here? This could have just been a call.
I know. Scarcity is a great way to influence.
Yeah, yeah. Right. So, if you can, let's just go back to the leadership, program that we talked about. So, if you were to sort of give the hallmarks of a good, successful leadership development program slash journey, what would the top 3 or 5 sort of, facets of a good leadership training program be in the current context, with
Yeah,
post-pandemic?
yeah. I think even prior to that, leadership development programs need a little bit of an overhaul,
Right.
because you know how we look at leadership development programs, how we measure them, all of that are somewhat of a convenience rather than really how it's effective, right? And typically only what is quantifiable gets measured, right? The softer elements don't get measured as well. So from a leadership development program, I think there are some issues that I personally have seen, and not that I'm saying that we've kind of cracked them and put something in place, but some of the ideas and thoughts around it are, first, at each level, I feel that what people want to develop, as they make their transition to a next level or a different stage of their career, broadly falls into 4 or 5 categories. I don't think it's vastly off. People will not, it doesn't veer off in very tangential directions. It's largely, you can bucket into a certain group's skills or capabilities, right? Um, and the problem with leadership development or management development programs is they try and cover all of these competencies over a period of 6 to 9 months, rather than deep attention to one competency. And it's a combination of, how you learn is a combination of self-learning, social learning. So you got to learn from your peers, learning from an expert, somebody who's a mentor, somebody who brings that expertise, learning from academia, right? Because there's a lot of research there. And if you combine all of these elements and weave that into a program and say, okay, strategic thinking is a area that you want to develop, then you bring a cohort of 10, 15 people who want to kind of develop, put them into this program where they are invested. And I think the first part of development is the person investing that time and energy. And plus, when you talk about the personalization element, they've chosen that as a skill that they want to develop. They're not kind of saying, okay, why does this element need to be in the program? I know this stuff, and I don't need this kind of thing, right? So if you construct it in that manner, I mean, we've got to learn through whether it'll be effective. But in my mind, theoretically, I feel that is a better way to approach it. It touches the element of personalization. It touches the element of social learning. It touches the element of learning from multiple sources, and there's self-learning as well, right? And I feel that's a better way. And I think then incorporate what I talked about, the final stage around teach back. You are committed to teaching others, and also that also helps your own shape your own thinking and perspective as well. That I think are some of the elements that you could incorporate into a learning program or
Right.
leadership program in
Yeah.
particular.
A philosophical or probably a tough question next, Seema. So, why do you think most of the learning programs have sort of regress to this norm where you want to cram everything in the same 3 or 6 month long journey, when it is quite obvious that you cannot influence so many different aspects of a group without they having been fully invested in it. But sort of that's the expectation. We don't really come from a traditional training or L&D kind of a background, so we get this, and that's been our standard approach of saying, okay, let's look at this one aspect, get opt-in for whoever is participating. We just hate, and we don't do these programs which like a mandated for people. We just don't do those kind of programs. But the demand is always like this. Oh, can you add more? Can you add more? And then we have to sort of push back, saying no, it's not going to work. Why have we got into this situation where there's this greed for, okay, let's cram as much as possible into that 6 month long program?
Yeah, I think you see learning as a product rather than a process. I simply put, right? That's what it is. So you all the features are kind of put into it rather than it's a journey. And I think it's a combination of learning and development teams trying to get the newest fad and put that in, and then throw it over the wall and expect it to be done and dusted with. And there's a tick box saying, I've done all of these elements. And measurable pieces, what is measured is definitely the quantifiable pieces. What coverage did you have? How many attendees did you have? What is their the score, overall feedback score? And I also feel that that's it stays in the realm of that. And it's a combination of both HR teams really changing that, and and leaders also understanding that it's not going to shift until you. So if you look at the real measures around leadership development are what percentage of your people have gone through a program, have moved into internal opportunities, and have taken on leadership roles, right? And so some of those things, and those are longer term measures. So quick fixes are what everybody likes. So I feel that's what it is. And so it's a combination of all of those elements coming together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So when we talk about an organization wanting to become, have a culture of continuous learning, what do you think should leaders sort of, encourage, and what are the concrete steps they can take to build this, culture of continuous learning? And it can't just be, I've made these courses available, so I can't say that that is continuous learning, right? That's the easy bit.
Yeah. One is role modeling.
Right.
They have to definitely role model that they do it themselves, because whatever role you're performing, you've got to learn, and you've got to kind of showcase that. The second is creating spaces for learning, and I would say that social learning element, bringing people together, and that's another piece that leaders have to do. I also think that the most valuable learning is through experience, which if it comes to, because on the job is always valued, but leadership development is, again, it's programmatic rather than experience driven, right? Which is one of the things we're actually working on at Epsilon now. There's a team which includes business leaders who's coming together along with the HR team to put together a program that is experience led. Three elements of it is, it is focus on experience, then there's a bit of sense making, and there's the mentoring piece as well. There's an external and internal mentor. So those are the elements as to how we're thinking about it. So I feel those are the kind of things that you have to learn. And there was this interesting concept of shadowing, right? Shadowing as being an important way for people to learn. That I think organizations need to invest a lot more in, and how to enable that. And also, especially in leadership development, it's this thing of you shadow a person. Let's say I get the opportunity to shadow somebody who's in a role that I aspire for, and he or she I see him or her operate in a certain way or making decisions. But they say that you have to actually decode that decision making, that thinking process to the individual. So seeing you in action is not enough. Breaking down your thinking process is also equally important for that person to learn. So I think all of those elements are what leaders need to facilitate to enhance learning in organizations. And the culture around continuous learning is typically around what leaders role model. And I think leaders influence the culture to a significant extent in organizations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, somebody was telling me that it's now become easier for them to do little bit of this shadowing because they can invite, the people they are mentoring to these calls,
Yeah.
which wouldn't have been that easy in an in-person kind of a setting. But they can just say, "Oh, my colleague is going to be part of this call," and they're through that. But like you said, it is not enough. They watching you is not enough because you also need to decode that, and that's not something which comes naturally to everyone.
Yeah.
It's like getting Sachin Tendulkar to describe how he plays that cover drive.
Yeah. And as a person also, instinctively you're doing certain things, right? But what were you thinking at that point of time? Actually, it's relevant and helpful to the leader also. Um, and I think, I feel learning always benefits the person who's learning and the person's teaching as well.
Right.
There's always like, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. One question that I missed asking you, Seema, earlier was that you mentioned about these, smaller teams. When you're thinking about these as microcultures. So, have there been examples like these which sort of were forced upon you, but because you tried something in one context, you figured this is working, and you wanted to sort of, take it up, scale it out to other areas? Did you do more of these? Let's do learning programs for small teams. Just like how we are doing engagement for small teams. Did anything like that happen?
Yeah, so learning programs for small teams, I think there's been more of an ask that's coming. We see smaller teams coming and asking for specific customized programs, and that ask is there more. I can't think of, I've seen that 3 or 4 examples of that happening. Not a lot to cite. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's been an ask that I've seen occasionally come through the learning and development team.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the last few questions, Seema. So you mentioned multiple sources of learning. So what are the books, podcasts, and what people do you have on your feed who that have shaped your thinking, and what would you recommend for our listeners and viewers?
Oh God, I am not great at remembering off the top of my mind. But I think podcasts, I listen to the ones, the Apple podcasts. And for me, because of the space that I am in, there's this organization called Disruptive HR. That is an organization, it's a UK-based organization. And the founder of that organization is very aligned to how I think about how HR should operate. I want to kind of push for an adult to adult relationships in HR, which is very hard because there's this notion of an adult to child relationship that forms in organizations with HR, right? And that's why I love the podcast. So Disruptive HR is one that I listen to. And she's comes through around HR tech and D&I. All of those have been great learnings. I do listen to some of the HBR ones that are, podcasts that are there. Yeah, Disruptive HR has been one of the things that I've gone to a lot. I try and look at various sources. That's my perspective around diversity is, try and learn from different types of people and different sources. So, whatever comes to mind, like founders of organizations, founders of startups, typically they're not constrained by doing things a certain way. And I feel that they are more experimental with things. And like if you think about um, companies that are doing some breakthrough stuff, is they're not constrained by old ways of working. So I think always listening to a startup is a great way, and I've gotten some ideas around that. And there are quite a few on who turn up on these podcasts as well.
Right. Yeah. Last section, Seema, and this is a section that we have as part of all our smartcasts, where we ask our guests what the future relevance of whatever we're going to ask you about is. Basically, your hot take on what is the future relevance of this thing. So the first one is, what do you think is the future relevance of gig workers in India?
I naturally think that we will evolve to have more gig workers and more specialized people, and I think it'll be both from a demand and supply side. People will want to choose that, and if you look at the West, they've really matured in terms of the gig economy, and I think India will go that way as well, and will be both because the talent crunch will force organization to seek more gig workers, and people wanting differences in their life and a different approach, and not kind of wanting to do different things in their life, they'll adopt a lifestyle that fits into that as well. So I see it as a direction that we will get into.
Okay. What do you think is the future relevance of universal basic income?
Explain that to me.
So universal basic income is where people are given a certain amount of money. Everyone is given that basic income. So basically, then people are expected to not work for a living, but
kind of a social security.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Some of the Scandinavian countries have been experimenting, right?
Yeah. Again, I find that social benefits will increase, and that's the way, that's a way for countries to develop that, and Scandinavian countries is a great example for that. I'm not an expert on the topic to add more, but I think that's, I've always looked at Scandinavian countries as setting direction for a lot of other countries. What they have tried in terms of practices, I feel countries like the UK are now starting to adopt, and I think more countries will move in that direction.
Okay, and the final one is, what do you think is the future relevance of all these job sites where people upload resumes and hope for a call?
I'm not a fan of them at all.
What do you think is the future relevance of it?
Because I'm not I shouldn't be saying this sitting in HR, but I tell people that if they want to get a job and find a role, it networks work best,
Right.
not job sites. And especially companies are using AI to sift through CVs, right? And we did a very small experiment. We did a very small experiment to test out a tool, thinking that should be purchased. And we looked at all of the CVs that had gotten selected and people had gotten through, and put their CVs through the tool, and they all got rejected. So it was interesting for us that you can manipulate your CV to kind of read it correctly for the job description, and so that your CV gets picked. But it still didn't work for us. At least it's a very small number of CVs that we tested it with, but was insightful, and maybe the bias that we all had kind of played into it also. But I feel networks is the way, and referrals is the way to kind of go.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. On that note, Seema, I think we covered the entire spectrum of HR and L&D. Covered a lot of what you've done at Epsilon. So, most of what you spoke, I think, was coming from, having had first-hand experience of designing these kind of programs. So that was great. One note of disappointment for me is going to be that I haven't still seen your dog. And I was hoping that, I'll see your dog on screen, but I think we'll let that pass.
Yeah,
But this was a great conversation.
I'll send a picture sometime. She's adorable. So I'm not at all biased. People who meet her just fall in love with her. She's a lab, and she did come and peek once or twice. So if you saw me distracted, she was around at that time, and yeah.
Yeah, next time when we do this, we'll definitely have both of you on screen.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Harish, great speaking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
And the opportunity as well.